The sky over New Santiago had become a permanent wound. Overhead, clouds roiled in unnatural patterns, their bruised shades of violet and black veined with streaks of iridescent green, an atmosphere corrupted beyond recovery by Emvyr terraforming spores. The stench of scorched metal and wet fungal decay hung heavy, clogging lungs and burning eyes. Above the drifting haze, the disjointed silhouettes of human skyscrapers jutted like broken ribs from the earth, their glass and steel skeletons wrapped in parasitic vines that pulsed faintly with alien life. On the ground, the biomech constructs of the Emvyr roamed with slow inevitability, each one a grotesque fusion of engineered muscle, carapace, and scavenged human architecture. Some bore the crumbling facades of old megatowers fused into their backs. Others dragged the remnants of streets and vehicles, encased in a latticework of sinew and fungal tendrils. Their passage left deep, steaming scars in the ruined earth, and in their wake, nothing remained but sludge and ash. Commander Holt Varen crouched beneath the collapsed arch of the Santiago Global Archives. Once the proud vault of Earth's accumulated knowledge, now a besieged sanctuary of memory. His respirator hissed against the toxic air, the cracked visor streaked with grime and condensation. Beneath the armor's weight, sweat slicked his skin, and every breath tasted faintly of blood and rust. His combat armor, once a standard-issue model for coalition officers, had been cannibalized beyond recognition. Ablative plating stitched with battlefield salvage, a hybrid power core jury-rigged from downed Emvyr tech. In his left hand, Holt gripped a battered data slate, the size of a child's textbook, though its layered crystalline storage held the distilled records of 1,000 years. It was warm against his glove, a faint pulse in sync with his own heartbeat. In his right, he cradled a kinetic rifle, an old model, but lovingly maintained, its stock wrapped with a strip of faded blue cloth, a child's scarf once, before the world was hollowed. His jaw tightened behind the mask, a flicker of memory he refused to indulge now. "Movement, South Entry," whispered Sergeant Pell, her voice a rasp of static over the encrypted comms. She perched high in the shattered frame of an observation spire, concealed beneath a nest of broken struts and polymer sheeting. Her rifle tracked the advancing forms with inhuman patience. Holt blinked a series of commands through his visor's cracked HUD, signaling the team to prepare for engagement. Theta unit, once a full platoon, now reduced to barely 2 fire teams, shifted into position, weaving between the fallen beams and ruptured service tunnels like wraiths. The rusted scent of blood and ozone permeated the air, mingling with the sour stink of Emvyr spores. The enemy emerged from the mist, their forms at once beautiful and terrible. Emvyr-bred shock troopers, elongated and skeletal, their semi-translucent flesh glistening with bioluminescent veins. Their skulls were long and knife-like, etched with living sigils that twisted subtly as they moved. They shambled forward with a sickening, clicking gait, their feet splitting open and resealing with each step. A low-frequency chant, a psychic resonance rather than sound, throbbed from them, a teeth-rattling pressure that gnawed at the edges of human minds. Pell's shot was first, a supercavitating rail round that bored cleanly through the lead creature's cranial node. It dropped mid-step, its death triggering a ripple of dissonance through the others. Holt's unit opened fire in a coordinated storm, kinetic projectiles tearing into alien flesh with brutal efficiency. For every alien that crumpled, 2 more surged forward, driven not by tactics but by overwhelming presence. "Line 2, Holt barked, voice cutting through the comms. Theta fell back in disciplined bursts, maintaining suppressive fire, buying precious seconds. They retreated into the deeper layers of the ruins, where the walls were covered in thick veils of alien mold and the remnants of human civilization. A child's mural, a broken hollow advert for a music festival, peeked through the growth like forgotten relics. Each footfall was treacherous, the ground soft where spore roots had hollowed the foundation, releasing clouds of fine, itching dust. Below them, nestled in the bedrock of the earth, the true prize awaited. The Heart Vault, a structure whose construction had spanned 3 desperate decades during the twilight of the Dominion crisis, when humanity first accepted that extinction was not only possible, but probable, a subbasement within the archives engineered decades ago under the Dominion crisis to withstand orbital bombardment and mass extinction events. Every beam, every wall layer had been built with the knowledge that humanity's story might one day need shelter from annihilation. Inside, a skeleton crew of archivists worked with feverish precision. Hardened data cores were arrayed like monoliths, each containing libraries of art, literature, science, philosophy, the collective essence of a world. Cora Ives stood at the center of the controlled chaos, her hands dancing across holographic consoles as she routed final data transfers. Her thin frame was wrapped in an armored pressure suit, the visor opaque save for a single slit revealing her narrowed, amber-flecked eyes. Sweat trickled down her temples, mingling with the grime of days without sleep. Around her, the other archivists murmured prayers to old gods, or none at all. Above them, in orbit, the viral crown loomed like a rotting mountain. Psychic emissions from its fungal towers blanketed the region, bolstering the Emvyr ground forces and battering human defenders with whispered false memories, visions of betrayal, despair, and surrender. Holt could feel it even now, phantom sensations of drowning, burning, being torn apart. 1,000 deaths murmured at the edges of reason. "Commander!" Pell's voice grated through the static. "Crown's deploying harvester units. If they breach the vault..." She left the thought unfinished. Holt paused beneath the shattered arch of what had once been a public gallery. A statue lay toppled nearby, a great bronze figure reaching upward, now corroded and split. He rested a gloved hand against its ruined face for a heartbeat, feeling the cold metal bite against his skin, grounding himself in the stubbornness of memory. Then he moved. He ripped open an old maintenance panel, revealing archaic wiring that pulsed faintly from auxiliary generators still buried deep within the facility's bones. With swift, brutal motions, he rigged the demolition charge, a shaped fusion core, salvaged from the ruins of Santiago's defense grid. Enough to collapse the substructure and bury the heart vault in 1,000 tons of rock and steel. Theta, confirm final fallback. One by one, green icons flared on his HUD. No hesitation, no regret. The Emvyr shock troopers crashed through the outer defenses, their psychic keening rising to a fever pitch. Theta fought savagely, carving a red path through the tide. Pell sniped from above, a reaper in the mist, until a tendril lashed from the gloom and wrenched her from her perch with a wet, final snap. Holt froze for half a breath, feeling the loss hammer through the comms channel like a blow to the chest, then slammed the grief down with a soldier's iron will. There would be time to mourn when the world was reclaimed. Or never. He pressed the ignition key to his armor's chestplate, armed the failsafe, and moved to cover the final retreat. Below, in the vault, Cora initiated the cultural seed, an encoded, self-replicating mimetic virus laced into every archive. A whisper of rebellion, a seed of mockery, a viral inversion of the Queen's designs. If the Emvyr seized the data, they would inherit not human culture, but a trap of poisoned memory, a mirror in which their victory would be their eternal humiliation. Holt triggered the fallback beacon. A soft chime in his ear. The heart vault seals collapsed inward with a thunderous roar as Holt's detonation cascaded through the tunnels. Dust and fire rolled up the shaft like a living thing. He turned and sprinted, kinetic rounds hissing past him, the air boiling with psychic static. A final thought lingered as the world folded inward. The Queen believed she fought for remembrance, but it was humanity that would write the last page. As darkness swallowed the ruins, Holt smiled. Not in despair, but in grim, feral triumph. The true war had only just begun. The viral crown hung above Earth like a bleeding wound in the sky, casting a pall of despair, awe, and silent terror across the scattered remnants of humanity, its fungal towers pulsing with slow, malevolent life. Cracks spiderwebbed across the hull's once flawless obsidian plating, revealing raw, seething biomatter beneath, a ship half dead, half dreaming. From its broken flanks, spores drifted down in shimmering veils, glittering in the poisoned light of a bloated sun, seeding the atmosphere with the psychic resonance of the Queen's will. No orbiting satellites remained to catalog the descent. No defensive platforms stirred to challenge it. Humanity's defenses had been shattered, reduced to memorials of futile defiance. The silence of space had become her kingdom. On the ruined earth below, civilians huddled in bombed-out husks of cities, watching the sky with hollowed eyes, praying to gods who no longer answered. Within the crown's marrow halls, Queen Ithrizeth brooded atop her throne of fused bone and memory glass, her mind a seething cauldron of bitterness and ambition. She had not come to Earth merely to conquer, she had come to engrave her will upon the marrow of another species, to forge a final legacy that not even time could devour. Her body, once lithe and terrible, now sagged with the rot of too many losses. Tubes of bioplasma and cracked obsidian conduits anchored her to the living ship, feeding her waning strength and siphoning away the poisons that had accumulated in her ancient blood. Her chitinous skin had dulled from its once gleaming violet to a sallow gray, and the once regal crests of her skull had begun to splinter at the edges. Beneath her stillness boiled a molten bitterness, the knowledge that her empire had rotted from within, that she now fought not for dominion but for remembrance. Around her, the last remnants of her court shuffled and twitched, their forms twisted by desperation and genetic decay. The ministers of flesh, now little more than eyeless mounds of breeding stock, gurgled praise. The singers of the last canticle, once the empire's orators, now clawed the walls with bony fingers, their mouths frozen in silent, unending screams. Only a handful retained coherent form, and they bent low in constant, mindless obeisance. Ithrizeth did not speak in words. She emanated. Her will pulsed outward in psychic currents, strong enough to shudder the great bulkheads of the ship, warping the memory glass that lined the marrow halls. Her emanations formed crystalline structures in the air, fractals of meaning too dense for any but the Emvyr to comprehend. Below, on the sundered earth, the Emvyr forces halted their ravaging for a single, reverent instant. Across every living mind, human, alien, even the newly spawned hybrids writhing from the terraforming pits, a vision unfurled. Some humans fought, teeth clenched, blood seeping from their nostrils as they tried to resist the invasion of their thoughts. But their struggles were brief and futile, snuffed out like candles in a hurricane. A single banner unfurled across the sky. On it, the Emvyr sigil, a coiled crown of thorns encircling a broken world, rendered not in paint or fabric, but in living plasma, burning into the upper atmosphere itself. A proclamation of the Queen's dominion. Surrender was no longer a negotiation. It was an edict, surrender memory itself. All histories, all myths, all identities would be consumed, reprocessed, rewritten to reflect the glory of the Emvyr Imperium. Humanity would endure, but only as a parody, a puppet race speaking the Queen's name in every cradle song, carving her praises into every stone. The old Earth, the one born of fire, sea, and dream, would vanish as surely as breath in the vacuum. Resistors would be obliterated at the neural level. Assimilated cultures would be psychically sterilized, their true memories severed and replaced with curated fabrications. Entire generations would be born believing they had always been Emvyr, their ancestors' sacrifices rendered meaningless, forgotten before they could be mourned. It was not conquest. It was erasure. The vision ended. Across the fractured continents, human survivors stumbled to their knees, retching, screaming, clawing at their own skulls as the psychic resonance battered them with alien certainty. Some few, trembling in their bunkers and ruined nests, bit their tongues bloody in a desperate bid to anchor themselves in pain and memory. But most were lost. Entire settlements crumbled without a shot fired. Networks of resistance went dark in waves, leaders driven to catatonia or self-destruction as their minds twisted inward against the tide of the Queen's command. In the wastelands of former Eurasia, survivors huddled in the carcasses of old-world cities, hiding from the prowling constructs and harvesting swarms. Once grand places, Moscow, Delhi, Berlin, were reduced to skeletal shadows where the Queens will remap the land itself. Rivers ran thick with bioplasma, forests moaned as their roots were converted into Emvyr psionic relays, and monuments to human triumph crumbled under fungal tides. In the shattered remains of a Moscow playground, a child's toy, a small, weathered teddy bear, lay half-buried in the spore-choked dirt, untouched, forgotten. Yet in the depths of the ruined Santiago, amid the smoking bones of the fallen archives, a different current stirred. Commander Holt Varen, bloodied but unbroken, lay hidden beneath the twisted wreckage of a collapsed metro line. His armor was shattered, his rifle lost, the data slate crushed beyond salvage. Splinters of steel and rebar pinned his leg, and each breath rasped blood through his cracked ribs. Yet within him, shielded by stubbornness older than logic, the seed of defiance burned. Through the pulsing psychic storm that tore at his mind, Holt clung to a memory, his mother's lullaby, sung in the shelter of a blackout cellar during his childhood wars, a thread of human warmth that no alien invasion could sever. Through its fragile strength, he saw the Queen's vision. He understood the scale of her ambition with the dreadful clarity of a man who had nothing left to lose. The Emvyr's words scratched against the walls of his mind, urging surrender, forgetfulness, blissful dissolution. And against it he whispered a memory, his father's voice, gravelly and fierce, teaching him as a boy, your mind is your last battlefield. Guard it beyond all else. The words anchored him, a lodestone in the maelstrom. And he smiled, a thin, cracked grimace against the dust and the dark. Because he also knew what she did not. Beneath the ashes of humanity's ruined cities, in the fragmented networks and corrupted data streams, the cultural virus had begun to bloom. A mimetic architecture woven into songs, myths, and art designed not to survive the Queen's psychic onslaught but to infect it. The virus was subtle. It did not scream defiance. It whispered doubt, encoded within lullabies sung by grieving mothers, hidden inside nursery rhymes in the final graffiti scrawled on crumbling walls, tucked into mathematical paradoxes and visual illusions embedded within archive cores. 1,000 little seeds, each designed to slip past the Queen's arrogance. Once embraced, the cultural virus would mirror her, twist her glory into mockery, her triumph into tragedy. Every time her spawn sang her praises, they would also sing the seeds of their own self-destruction. Every monument to her victory would rot from within, infected with ironies she could neither perceive nor remove. And once planted, ideas were harder to kill than any army. High above, in the rotting vaults of the viral crown, Queen Itherzeth leaned back against her throne. She drank deep of the planet's anguish, her consciousness expanding outward, stretching thin across the living world like a web of bleeding silk. She did not notice the infection coiling at the edges of her triumph. She did not yet hear the laughter sewn into the bones of her new empire. But soon she would. And by then it would be far, far too late. Beneath the poisoned skies, the world twisted into unfamiliar shapes. The few surviving humans who gazed upward felt not just horror but a hollow ache. A bone-deep certainty that everything they had known was being unmade beyond hope. The land itself became a corpse in slow decay, its tissues rewoven by Emvyr design. Where cities had once stood, New Santiago, Shanghai, Lagos. Immense fungal towers rose like obscene monuments, pulsing and shuddering as they exhaled spores into the shifting winds. Their surfaces seethed with creeping tendrils, forming crude facsimiles of ancient Emvyr glyphs that shifted and rearranged as if whispering prayers to a dead pantheon. These new growths were not built for habitation or governance. They were engines of transformation, vast incubators in which humanity's flesh and mind were remade. Each tower housed vast interior chambers lined with living walls, oozing fluids that rewrote the biological blueprints of anything placed within. They hummed with a sound below hearing, a resonant psychic frequency that battered willpower like a ceaseless tide. The Queen's harvester units, writhing, biomechanical amalgams of bone, sinew, and alloy, swept across the surface. They moved in systematic grids, methodical as machines but grotesquely alive, their segmented limbs exuding clouds of sedative spores. Survivors who breathed the tainted air found themselves slowing, memories blurring, identities leaking away like water through cupped hands. Entire enclaves were dragged into the conversion pits. Colossal arenas sunk deep into the earth, ringed by living walls that pulsed with the captured neural signatures of extinct Emvyr monarchs. The atmosphere boiled with mutagenic gases, thick enough to peel skin and dissolve lungs, while psychic fields bent minds into compliance. The ground itself, riddled with capillaries of alien tissue, thrummed with the Queen's emanations. There, the real work began. In the moments before the resin sealed shut, some captives cried out, not in fear, but in whispered fragments of old prayers, lullabies, names of lost children, threads of humanity that defied annihilation. Civilians, men, women, children, were suspended in cocoons of living resin. Some reached out with trembling hands before the resin hardened, clinging to one another, whispering fragmented goodbyes that dissolved into the suffocating embrace of the Queen's machinery. Neural interfaces, spined like black thorns, laced into their skulls, draining identity and flooding minds with the Emvyr template. Loyalty, reverence, worship. Bodies shifted under the assault, spines elongated into grotesque arches, ribs reknitted to shield alien hearts, eyes clouded into blank mirrors reflecting only the Queen's image. Language collapsed, memory blurred, names dissolved into the slurry of the Imperium's rebirth. But something was wrong. The first broodlings born of human stock emerged misshapen, their psychic harmonics dissonant. Instead of perfect echoes of the Emvyr will, they twitched with unbidden spasms of laughter, bursts of irrational terror, flickers of forbidden song. Some muttered nonsense under their breath, half-forgotten nursery rhymes, ancient myths of rebellion and fire. Their minds, intended to be blank slates, buzzed with ghost memories of resistance. In the crown's core chambers, Queen Ithrazeth received reports from the overseers. Her once clear emanations flickered with frustration and disbelief. She intensified the conversion protocols, ordering entire sectors vaporized when they produced corrupted offspring. Still, the infection spread. Overseers, once emotionless, hesitated in their duties, glancing nervously at each other when strange symbols appeared, or when the converted sang alien songs not written into their protocols. Deep within the conversion pits, strange phenomena multiplied. A harvested youth scrawled spirals into the living walls, spirals that, when traced, induced vertigo and nausea in the overseers. Converted singers wove melodies no Emvyr algorithm could untangle, tunes that carried undertones of defiance hidden in their lullabies. The Queen's sculptors worked without pause, but for every 100 successful conversions, a handful emerged carrying the hidden seed, the viral code embedded in culture, infecting form and mind alike. At the ragged edge of the Pacifica ruins, Holt Varen watched a harvester convoy crawl across the horizon. For a fleeting heartbeat, despair gnawed at him, a cold whisper that survival was meaningless in the shadow of such ruin. But he crushed it beneath the stubborn weight of memory and duty. His body trembled from untreated wounds, wrapped in salvaged fabrics and cracked armor plates. But his mind, the last stronghold, remained intact. Hidden within the shattered shell of an abandoned magrail depot, he catalogued the abominations through broken optics. Humans twisted into mockeries, bearing the crown's sigil but singing the wrong songs, dreaming the wrong dreams. The sight sickened him. And yet, it filled him with a grim, feral hope. Korra's virus was working. The Queen had made a fundamental error, believing that flesh alone could be rewritten. But humanity's truth was not in bone or blood. It was in the stories whispered in darkness, the songs sung around dying fires, the names passed from trembling lips to stubborn ears. Culture could not be carved out with scalpels. Memory could not be erased by force. The cultural virus had taken root where the Queen could not see, in meaning itself. Each harvester unit carried unknowingly infected spawn back to the fungal towers, where their warped songs and half-remembered myths spread like wildfire through the psychic lattice of the Emvyr remnant. Doubt blossomed. Dissonance grew. The Queen's empire, reborn in agony, was already rotting from within. Holt shifted his weight, cringing at the spike of pain lancing up his side. He gripped the butt of his salvaged rifle tighter, feeling the battered metal's weight anchor him to reality. Around him, the ruins moaned as the dusk winds slithered through broken girders and snapped banners. In the distance, a low hum began to build, the approach of another conversion wave. The sky churned with oily clouds. Lightning, tinted sickly green, lanced across the heavens. Holt rose, leaning heavily on the rifle, and limped into the choking dusk. It was not enough to survive. Somewhere deep inside, he hummed a fragment of an old war song, a melody passed from rebels to refugees, a tune the Queen could never comprehend. It was time to fight back. The world would not be reclaimed by strength of arms alone. It would be reclaimed through defiance so profound that even the Emvyr's poisoned dreams could not contain it. And Holt Varen, last son of fallen Santiago, would make certain the Queen heard humanity's final answer, etched into every corrupted hymn and broken monument she built upon their graves. Night fell across the scarred remains of Pacifica, though the darkness brought no comfort. Among the few survivors, there was no relief, only a deeper fear, a primal dread sharpened by memories of nights when loved ones had vanished into the mist. In the ruined bones of cities, the fungal towers glowed sickly against the horizon, casting long shadows that writhed like dying things. Ash drifted through the air in slow, deliberate spirals, mixing with the fine spores that clung to every surface, every breath. The remains of street signs and banners flapped weakly in the poisoned wind, their slogans for vanished worlds barely legible: unity through progress, tomorrow belongs to us. Holt Varen limped through the wreckage of what had once been San Pasquale district, guided by the faint flicker of dying emergency beacons. His battered respirator hissed softly, struggling to filter the tainted air. Each step was a negotiation between endurance and agony, but he moved with purpose, following an ancient instinct that had outlived logic: find others. Build. He passed hollowed-out transit hubs where only skeletal mag trains remained, their hulls etched by acid rain and ember spores. Corpses lay slumped along station walls, some clutching relics of normalcy, a child's backpack, a faded wedding photograph, things that no longer had a place in this ravaged world. He found them where hope had long since withered, a pocket of survivors hidden beneath the ruins of an old hydroelectric plant. Here, tiny rituals endured, a scratched tally of days passed on a rusted pipe, a single, tattered children's book passed from hand to hand, a whispered promise before sleep to remember real names. Barely 24, hollow-eyed and skeletal, armed with scavenged weapons and memories of a world that no longer existed. They were gaunt silhouettes lit by the stolen bioluminescence of captured ember tissue, their faces drawn taut with hunger and haunted by more than physical starvation. Among them moved Cora Ives, her pressure suit patched with crude hand-stitching, her face smudged with grime but her gaze sharp as cut glass. She moved from person to person, tending wounds, whispering fragments of forbidden songs that reminded them they were still human. "You're late," she said without humor, helping Holt over the threshold into the dim shelter. Around her, the survivors turned wary eyes toward Holt, measuring him as both savior and liability, as every new arrival had to be. "Had to make sure I was worth the risk," Holt rasped, the words scraping from a throat lined with blood. He sank onto a makeshift pallet of bundled wiring and tarp, blinking against the dim bioluminescence of fungal lamps, ironic, stolen from the enemy itself. Around him, whispers passed like wind over broken stones. Holt caught fragments: fighter, infected? Too late. Always the same doubts, the same scars. Cora knelt beside him, pressing a cracked datapad into his palm. Its screen flickered weakly, displaying the hard evidence of their slow, stubborn victory: infection rates, mimetic anomalies, deviation patterns within the ember broods. The cultural virus was no longer a whisper. It was a roar beneath the Queen's throne. "The lattice is fracturing," Cora said quietly, her voice almost reverent. "The more they assimilate, the worse it gets. Doubt, madness, memory failures. Some of their overseers have started self-terminating." "Good," Holt said, teeth flashing in a grim smile. "We can work with madness." They laid their plans in the dying light. Not a counterattack, that dream was ash. Not yet. But an acceleration. A series of targeted strikes not against the Ember forces, but against meaning itself, destroying relics of the Queen's culture, seeding viral art into the conversion fields, inserting paradoxes into the psychic frequencies. Weaponizing narrative. Cora showed him the first of the echo codes, mimetic clusters designed to embed themselves into the Ember psychic structures like tumors. Already, rumors trickled back of a patrol near San Venturo that collapsed into chaos after encountering a single carved symbol, an infinity loop spiraling into nothing. Simple, brutal things, a symbol that could not be fully processed, a song with no ending, a story that, once heard, made every loyalty suspect. A child's drawing of a spiral, untraceable yet infinitely recursive. A parable with no moral, but one that gnawed at the soul. "It won't be clean," she warned, brushing soot from the corner of the screen. "It won't be humane." "Nothing about this is," Holt replied. His voice was low, almost tender, as he looked at the gathered faces. "But they'll remember us. Even if they don't know why." They set to work. Ragged teams slipped through the ruins under the cover of fungal storms and Ember patrol shifts. They planted echo codes like landmines, etched into walls, encoded into whispered lullabies, hidden within the weave of infected banners. Some were captured, twisted into new horrors, but enough succeeded that the infection spread faster than the Ember could adapt. Each successful strike left psychic scars on the Ember lattice. Overseers began to weep in public, their emanations fraying into incoherence. Broodlings clutched at themselves, screaming names no Ember tongue could pronounce, names from dead human cities, names of resistance. In the fungal towers, murals once glorifying the Queen's ascension began to warp. The air within the towers thickened with a cloying, metallic stench, and the walls grew damp and soft to the touch, weeping a thin, rancid ichor. Carved faces twisted into masks of sorrow. Some towers emitted low, mournful tones instead of triumphant psychic hymns, a dirge for an empire that had not yet realized it was dying. And somewhere, in the decaying spires of the viral crown, Queen Itherzeth stirred uneasily on her throne. Her dreams, once corridors of shining conquest, became tangled labyrinths of confusion and betrayal. Her court, already diminished, began to fall into schism, some whispering dissent, others falling into catatonic despair. For the first time since the fall of her empire, she dreamed, and deep within the labyrinth of her visions, a thread of confusion and fear knotted itself around her consciousness, tightening with every echo of laughter. And in her dreams she heard laughter, low, defiant, human, echoing through the ruins she thought she had conquered. It was not the laughter of triumph, nor of cruelty. It was the laughter of something she could never understand. Survival stripped of pride. Memory stripped of lies. The laughter of a species that had lost everything and refused, with their dying breath, to let themselves be forgotten. The fungal storms grew stronger with each passing cycle, blackening the sky with clouds dense enough to blot out the crippled sun. Beneath their weight, insurgents trudged forward with raw throats and blistered skin, their minds fraying under the unending psychic pressure, yet clinging stubbornly to their missions. Lightning, no longer natural, rippled green and violet across the heavens, a chemical ballet fueled by Emvyr terraforming protocols long abandoned to entropy. Beneath their suffocating shadow, the ruins of Earth's last cities became battlegrounds of a new, subtler war, one fought not with armies, but with ideas. Holtverin moved through the charred skeletons of Los Nidos, guiding another team of insurgents. Not soldiers, but poets, musicians, coders, archivists. Survivors who understood that the true battlefield was no longer measured in territory, but in memory and meaning. They wore scraps of armor pieced together from old-world ruins and Emvyr salvage, their faces masked by battered respirators. Some carried personal relics woven into their gear, a child's locket, a wedding ring strung around a neck, an ancient coin sewn into a sleeve, anchors to memories the Queen could not erase. Some bore tattoos on their hands and faces, ancient glyphs of resistance, prayers disguised as art, cultural sigils that carried their defiance like armor against the psychic tide. They carried no heavy weapons. Their arsenal fit into weathered satchels and half-broken data slates. Echo codes, glyph bombs, auditory snares, tools designed to infiltrate the Queen's decaying lattice and infect it from within. Their target loomed ahead, a spire node, a secondary Emvyr structure meant to reinforce psychic cohesion among converted human broodlings. It pulsed with a sluggish, uneasy glow, its walls shifting in and out of alignment, warping between geometric perfection and sagging rot. The node had once been a cathedral to Emvyr thought, but now it festered like an open wound. 3 minutes, Cora whispered over the comms, her voice a rasp shaped by weeks of unfiltered air. Holt gave a slight nod, his eyes never leaving the undulating surface of the node. Around them, the city was a graveyard. Skyscrapers collapsed inward like withered husks, their steel bones exposed to the rancid winds. Streets had been reduced to trenches choked with ash, broken glass, and the brittle remains of bones. Old mag-rail cars, half digested by creeping fungal growths, jutted from the earth like skeletal fingers. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the fungal towers keened a dirge of fraying power, a resonance low enough to vibrate through the ground, rattling loose teeth and stirring primal fears in the gut. The insurgents split into 2 groups. Holt led the first wave, the planters, who embedded glyph bombs into the node's outer cortex, their hands steady despite the tremors racking their bodies. Cora led the second, the singers, who would deploy the auditory snares, recursive melodies tuned to resonate within Emvyr psychic pathways, destabilizing thought structures at their foundations. The assault began with silence. No bullets, no charges, only songs, half-remembered human folk songs warped into recursive paradoxes, whispered against the toxic wind. A child's lullaby that looped upon itself, a nursery rhyme that questioned its own ending. The node reacted almost immediately. Waves of psychic backlash slammed into the insurgents, making their vision blur and ears bleed, forcing them to grit teeth against vertigo and despair even as they planted the last of the echoes. Its surface rippled, trying to harden against the intrusion. Pulses of psychic backlash lashed outward, stunning one of the singers, but the others pressed on, embedding more echoes with each heartbeat. The glyph bombs activated with a shimmer, not an explosion, conceptual detonations that fractured psychic consensus. Symbols etched into the node's skin twisted into impossible geometries, breaking the structure's logical cohesion. The node spasmed, its pulse shattering into erratic bursts of light. Across the lattice, the effects were immediate. Broodlings in nearby sectors collapsed, clutching at their skulls as contradictory memories bloomed like cancers in their minds. Overseers began emanating panic frequencies, disrupting command hierarchies and fracturing local control structures. In the haze, Holt saw one overseer, a towering, insectal Emvyr remnant, turn its weapon against its own broodlings, shrieking an incoherent anthem of loss before crumpling into spasms. Beyond Los Nidos, the infection spread like wildfire. A low hum suffused the air, an unnatural vibration that tasted metallic on the tongue and made the brittle ground shiver beneath their boots. Cultural virus strains mutated, reshaping themselves faster than the Emvyr psychic matrix could adapt. Echo codes bloomed into new forms, a hymn that shattered communal dreams, a sigil that made loyalty taste like bile, a story that turned submission into existential nausea. Each small act, each carved symbol, each whispered paradox, further cracked the lattice. In hidden nodes across the ruins, insurgents activated secondary payloads, fable bombs, constructed from stitched mythologies that wove themselves into Emvyr thought like cognitive plagues. Harvester units, once terrifying in their relentless efficiency, hesitated in their work, their bioengines humming discordantly. And higher still, in the heart of the viral crown, Queen Ithrizeth convulsed on her throne. She tasted it now, not just defiance but contamination. Fragments of alien memories flickered unbidden through her mind. A child's laughter by a river she had never seen. A mother's fierce prayer over a grave she had never buried. They gnawed at her certainties, loosening the keystones of her identity. Not rebellion by force, but by meaning. She lashed out with sweeping psychic storms, trying to excise the infection, but every sweep only seemed to deepen the fractures. Within her marrow halls, the surviving members of her court quivered and howled, their forms distorting into grotesque parodies of their former glory. The queen's dreams, once glistening realms of order and dominion, became labyrinths of doubt, filled with mocking echoes of laughter. Her most loyal spawn began to falter. Some questioned orders aloud, an act once unthinkable. Some fled into the wastes, gibbering half-formed parables. Some sang. And those songs carried the seeds of ruin. The seed of insurrection had been planted. It had rooted itself deeper than the queen could reach. It fed not on flesh but on memory, on identity, on the one thing the Emvyr could never fully conquer. And like all true seeds, it would grow whether she willed it or not. The viral crown drifted above the poisoned earth like a wounded predator, its fungal spires shedding tendrils of spore and psychic static. Deep within its failing core, Queen Ithrizeth, once a goddess to billions, felt a gnawing isolation take root, an ancient, primal terror she had not known since her earliest spawnling days. Once a flawless symbol of Emvyr supremacy, the crown now hung in the sky like a gangrenous limb, bloated and failing. Its surface rippled with lesions where the psychic lattice had fractured, exposing the raw, throbbing mass of decaying biomass underneath. Within its failing bulk, Queen Ithrizeth struggled to hold the Imperium's shattered remnants together. Every pulse of her will, every emanation she unleashed, fractured against unseen resistance, scattering like ash against a storm. The monumental architecture of her psychic empire, once so rigid, so immovable, had become a house of cards trembling in a rising gale. The mindfall had begun. It started in the outer broods. Converted humans, once pliant and obedient, now twitched and muttered to themselves. Their psychic harmonics, the frequencies that bound their collective mind, dissonated, slipping out of tune like a dying symphony. Overseers fought to reassert control, but their commands returned garbled, their thought streams fouled by contradictions and recursive feedback. Broodlings turned against each other. In the husks of fallen cities, Port Helix, Shinzai District, New Casablanca, entire enclaves fell into chaos. Some tore at their own bodies, raving in languages half-remembered from human myth. One, a young broodling with pale, cracked skin, clutched a scrap of ruined cloth to its chest, a child's blanket, before collapsing into silence, a flicker of human memory glinting and dying in its vacant eyes. Port Helix, Shinzai District. New Casablanca, entire enclaves fell into chaos. Some tore at their own bodies, raving in languages half-remembered from human myth. Others gathered in silent circles, tracing endless spirals into the dust, humming fractured songs with no beginning and no end. The infection had seated itself too deeply. The queen lashed out, flooding the lattice with raw dominance, a psychic tidal wave meant to drown the insurrection. Minds buckled under the pressure, but not all snapped. Some absorbed the attack, twisted it, reflected it back. Overseers crumpled in spasms, their once pristine auras corroded with paradox. Every psychic scream that rippled through the lattice only amplified the collapse. Holtverin watched the unraveling from a shattered broadcast tower in the Pacifica wastes. The tower's skeletal frame shuddered under the weight of the fungal storms, yet from its broken crown he had line of sight across the blighted plains. Around him, his insurgents, their armor patched with salvaged memory threads, tracked the Mindfall's progress on cracked, flickering interfaces. "She's hemorrhaging control," Cora said, her voice barely audible over the static winds. The lenses over her eyes glowed faintly, displaying ripples of data from the failing Emvyr network. Structural integrity of the lattice dropped another 7% in the last hour. "The Mindfall's accelerating," Holt murmured. He clenched his hands, feeling the worn leather of his gloves crackle. But it's not enough. Below, fungal growths shriveled and blackened. Emvyr spires sagged inward, their psychic supports corroded by cognitive contagion. The very air tasted cleaner, a sharp tang of ozone and burnt spores touched by a ghost of the world that once was. But Holt knew decay was not victory. The queen's core remained intact, buried deep within the crown, shielded by layers of decaying thought and the tattered remnants of loyalty. As long as she endured, the infection could stall, mutate, even reverse itself in horrifying new forms. "We break the mind," Holt said, staring into the seething, violet-streaked sky. "Or we die forgotten." Preparations began. Fear simmered under the surface of every insurgent. Faces grim, hands trembling slightly as they calibrated memory grenades and synaptic lances, they moved with the resolve of those who knew they marched toward oblivion but chose to march anyway. They would not breach the crown with force. It was impregnable to material assault. But through the lattice's fractures, through the weaknesses seeded by their cultural virus, they would forge a path, a psychic incursion. A final battle fought not with blades, but with myths, memories, and the stubborn, feral will of humanity. In the ruins below, insurgents prepared their instruments, echo amplifiers, mnemonic disruptors, memory grenades woven from the last songs of dying tribes. Each device tuned to destabilize the lattice further, to carve open an entry point through the storm of thought. Holt and Cora stood at the center of it all, their hands joined in a brief, silent vow. They were not generals now. They were architects of rebellion against annihilation. Holt gathered his insurgents beneath the shadow of the dying spires. Together, they sang. Old songs, new songs, songs with no name, songs that burned with sorrow, rage, and defiance. Their voices rose into the storm, a signal flare hurled against the dark. Within the crown, Queen Itherzeth reeled, her mind lurching through alien sensations. A coldness she could not name gripped her, a sudden flash of loneliness so vast and unfamiliar it made her ancient heart convulse with a fear beyond domination or defeat. Fragmented memories leaked through her mind, foreign and corrosive, a child's first step on cracked earth, a lover's whisper in a language never spoken in her empire, a soldier's tear over a fallen comrade. Every echo clawed deeper, unraveling the steel threads of her authority. The fungal towers across the earth began to weep black ichor, their biological frameworks collapsing inward as psychic energy bled away. Rudlings screamed, clawing at invisible enemies. Overseers set themselves aflame to escape the doubt gnawing at their minds. The mindfall deepened. Across the Pacifica wastes, insurgents advanced toward the coordinates Holt had marked, the weakest rupture in the crown's psychic barrier. Through the storm, through the ash and death, they marched. Boots crunched over the brittle remains of bone and burned foliage, the air stung like broken glass against raw skin. Every breath was a war fought in miniature. At the front, Holtverin moved like a blade drawn from the ashes of history. And within the rotting crown, Queen Itherzeth, the last empress of the Emvyr, heard the music of her undoing, growing louder with every step they took. The breach into the viral crown's psychic lattice felt less like crossing a threshold and more like stepping into a dying dream. A heavy ache bloomed behind the insurgents' eyes, the strain of stepping into a space where reality bled and wept around every thought. Reality thinned, stretched into blurred edges of thought and sensation. Holtverin gritted his teeth against the vertigo as he and his insurgents crossed the rupture point, their bodies dissolving into the dream space without ceremony, their physical forms trailing ghostly afterimages of memory and intent. The crown's interior was not physical, not anymore. Here, The halls and spires were woven from memory and fear, shifting structures built from stolen dreams. Fragmented visions of humanity's fall littered the psychic landscape. Skeletal cities suspended in violet mist, oceans of grasping hands, skies stitched with broken wings. Monuments of broken Emvyr pride jutted from the mist, defaced with human graffiti. Spirals, endless loops, slogans and forgotten tongues that pulsed with insidious life. The insurgents moved in tight formation, their minds shielded by mnemonic disruptors that hummed low in the bone. Even so, stray memories clawed at them, ghosts of lost homes, of loved ones forgotten, of futures stolen. A lesser force would have fractured instantly, subsumed by despair. But these were not ordinary fighters. They carried within them the distilled sorrow and fury of a dying species, honed into weapons sharper than any blade. The dreamscape fought them with every step. Dead loved ones appeared at the edges of sight, whispering false welcomes. One insurgent, a woman named Salis, stumbled briefly, tears welling as a vision of her long-dead son beckoned. But she gritted her teeth, tore her gaze away, and pressed forward, her resolve hardening into a blade. Phantom Emvyr deities loomed overhead, their vast forms cracking and bleeding illusions. The insurgents answered with silence and steel-eyed resolve, pressing onward. Ahead, at the crown's heart, the throne of memory awaited. It was not a seat, but a monolith, a towering edifice of fused bone, crystalline thought, and calcified authority, saturated with the psychic weight of the Emvyr Imperium. Around it swirled the Queen's emanations, now brittle, desperate, barely holding coherence. Phantom shapes lurched at the edges of sight, failed echoes of loyalty, fading remnants of ancient victories turned to ash. Queen Ithrizeth herself stood before the throne, a ruin of the being she had once been. Her chitinous skin cracked and wept luminous ichor. Her regal crest sagged, the proud lines of her form twisted and buckled. The gold of her once resplendent body had dulled to sickly green and gray, marred by running veins of black corruption. Her eyes, once galaxies of command, now flickered with confusion, grief, and a terrible, gnawing dread. She opened her arms, a broken parody of welcome, her voice ragged and layered with countless stolen tongues. "Come," she rasped. "Be remembered." But Holt knew they had not come to be remembered. They had come to end her. The insurgents unleashed their final weapon, the chorus of echoes. It began with a whisper, a single note of human grief, that buzzed through the air like an electric current, raising gooseflesh along every insurgent's skin, vibrating deep in their bones as it built into a tidal wave of memory. Songs from the burning cities, cries from the long dead, laughter from children never born. Every note a blade, every harmony a hammer against the throne's foundations. Stories of sacrifice, of dreams never fulfilled, of stubborn survival against impossible odds. The cumulative ache of a world that refused to be forgotten. The Queen screamed, her form fracturing into kaleidoscopic shards of failing thought. She lashed out with everything she had left, trying to overwrite the insurgents' identities, to drown them in fabricated glories, to reforge them as echoes of her empire. But their defenses were not rooted in walls or shields. They were rooted in truth. Each insurgent carried within them an uncorrupted memory, a tether to reality so stubborn, so furious, it could not be rewritten. A mother's touch, a fallen brother's final smile, promise whispered in the dark, a sunrise glimpsed after too long underground. The Queen's assaults shattered harmlessly against them. With a final, collective cry, the insurgents directed the chorus into the heart of the throne. Cracks split the monolith, light bleeding from its wounds. The very fabric of the dreamscape shuddered, the towers of memory groaning and bending as centuries of stolen meaning began to unravel. The crown's fungal towers on earth shuddered and collapsed, spewing clouds of blackened spores that drifted like funeral shrouds across the wasted landscapes. Across the Pacifica wastes and beyond, broodlings fell where they stood, their minds snapping free from the lattice into sudden, terrible freedom. Many died instantly, their psyches too fragile to bear the shock. Others staggered into the ruins, lost but alive, haunted by fragmentary visions of what they had been forced to forget. Queen Ithrazeth staggered backward, her arms reaching imploringly toward the insurgents. Not in command, but in desperate, uncomprehending plea. For a heartbeat, her expression fractured, and in her wide, failing eyes flickered a terrible recognition. Not rage, but regret. The Empress of endless dominions, reduced to a begging ruin. Holt-Varen stepped forward, his voice low and steady. "You forgot," he said, "that we are not born of memory." He reached out, and with the barest brush of thought, toppled the throne of memory. The monolith shattered with a soundless detonation, a burst of psychic light that tore through the crown's decaying architecture. Structures of dream and domination imploded, folding inward like burning paper. The crown convulsed one last time, then began to fall. The insurgents fell with it, swallowed by light and sound and the breaking of a world. Ash rained from the sky. The fungal clouds parted. Above the ruins of the earth, the sky opened clean, clear, and endless. The air, once thick with spore and ash, smelled faintly of cold iron and wet stone, a scent untouched by alien corruption, crisp and biting against raw lungs. Stars glimmered like newborn hopes. The hollow coronation was complete, and humanity, scarred but unbroken, would write its own story once more with blood, with sorrow, and with an undying, stubborn dream. The first light after the fall of the crown was not sunlight, but the ghostly shimmer of debris tumbling through the atmosphere. Shattered fragments of the viral monolith, still smoldering with the last vestiges of psychic energy, rained down across the wounded continents. Trails of dying fire etched lines across the bruised heavens, burning away the last traces of Emvyr dominion. Where they struck, the earth trembled, but there was no more terror in it. Only aftermath, vast and solemn. Holt-Varen awoke beneath a sky so painfully clear it felt alien, as if the very atmosphere had been scrubbed raw by the fall. For a long moment he simply stared upward, chest tight, struggling to accept the silence, the absence of Emvyr song, and feeling a hollow awe settle over his battered heart. His body ached in ways no battlefield wound could explain, as if his very soul had been battered against the bones of reality. Around him, the other insurgents stirred, Cora, Salus, Bryn, and a handful of others, the last survivors who had borne the weight of the mindfall. They stood atop a new world, or rather, the broken bones of an old one, freed from the parasitic embrace of their conquerors. The ruins of the fungal tower smoldered on every horizon. In the distance, a child emerged from the dust, no older than 8, barefoot and wide-eyed, reaching out tentative fingers to touch the blackened remains of a toppled spire as if seeking to understand the death of giants. Vast carcasses of twisted biometal and blackened growth slumped over shattered cities. Entire landscapes once reshaped by Emvyr were collapsing back into chaotic ruin, rivers carving new paths through toppled megastructures, forests struggling to reclaim ashen ground. The winds that scoured the earth carried no psychic resonance now, only silence, raw and immense, broken occasionally by the ragged cries of survivors emerging from the dust. In the distance, where the largest shard of the crown had fallen, a massive crater smoked against the landscape, its edges glittering with strange, crystalline remnants. The impact had split ancient mountain ranges, rerouted rivers, and blackened forests for miles around. From the wreckage, no Emvyr shapes rose. The queen was gone. "It's over," Cora said, her voice a whisper nearly lost in the vastness. But Holt's gaze remained fixed on the crater, his instincts wary. Victory was never so simple. Over the next days, they moved through the wastelands, gathering those who had survived, those freed from the lattice, now adrift in broken memories and phantom pain. Many were hollowed shells, their identities a patchwork of old human truths and invasive Emvyr lies. Others clung to fragments of who they had been, enough, perhaps, to begin again. The insurgents became shepherds of a shattered species. They built camps from the wreckage of old cities, scoured the ruins for medicines, seeds, books, anything that could help mend the broken world. Every effort carried risk. Water sources were fouled with biotoxins, mutated beasts stalked the deep ruins, and old Emvyr constructs twitched sporadically in the wreckage, half-dead but still dangerous. They taught the freed survivors how to speak again, how to remember, how to dream without permission. Around flickering fires, old songs were tentatively sung, new myths born of ash and sorrow whispered into existence. But the earth itself was wounded. Great dead zones stretched across continents where the air smelled of burnt plastic and wet iron, and the soil crumbled to gray ash at the lightest touch, leaving skeletal trees to stand sentinel over fields of decay. Seas boiled where Emvyr terraforming engines had failed catastrophically. Strange, twisted flora, mutations of Emvyr biostructures still clung to the bones of cities, fighting against the slow return of native life. And Holt carried the burden of memory, the knowledge that while the Queen had fallen, her poisons lingered. The psychic scars ran deep. Some remnants of the Emvyr root colonies hidden in deep vaults, rogue agents wandering the wastelands, would inevitably surface. There would be no clean ending. The work of reclamation would span generations, fought not with guns alone, but with stories, songs, and stubborn will. Still, there was a beginning. One night, by the flickering fire of scavenged ruins, Cora handed Holt a relic, a battered data slate, its surface scorched but intact. As he took it, a flash of memory surged, his younger self hunched over an old pre-collapsed terminal, tracing his fingers over a map of Earth's forgotten oceans, dreaming of places he would never see. The same hope, fragile and stubborn, flickered now in the battered slate between his hands. Within it were fragments of the old world, songs, poems, images, the raw, imperfect art of a people who had refused oblivion. Childhood drawings of blue skies and green fields. Scraps of poetry about rain on stone streets. A voice recording of a mother's lullaby barely audible through static. Holt turned the slate over in his hands, the faces of the fallen reflected in its cracked surface. A melody drifted from the device, faint and broken, a half-remembered song his mother had once sung to him under a tin roof during the first years of war, and for a moment the ghost of a smile touched his lips. He saw not just loss, but continuity. A thread unbroken by conquest or despair, woven through every shattered soul still breathing. He looked to the stars, to the vast, wounded sky, a sky no longer tainted by Emvyr will, but open, boundless, terrifying in its possibilities. "We are the ashes," he said quietly, "and we are the fire." And across the wastes, from the broken cities to the skeletal mountains, a new story began to rise, rough and bitter, luminous and wild, written not by queens or conquerors, but by the stubborn, aching hands of those who remembered how to hope. The future would not be easy, but it would be theirs. The first rains after the fall came without warning. They swept across the broken continents in sheets of heavy, cold water, washing the ash from blackened soil and the last spores from the twisted wreckage. Rivers, once diverted by Emvyr terraforming, clawed hungrily at their ancient beds. Canyons widened as the wounded earth heaved under the sudden deluge. The land hissed and steamed where biocontaminants resisted, a testament to centuries of scarred memories etched into the soil. In the refugee camps scattered among the ruins, the survivors lifted their faces to the downpour with silent awe. For many, it was the first rain untainted by Emvyr manipulation they had ever known, a baptism of sorts, raw and unmediated. Children danced barefoot in the mud, their laughter a brittle but resilient sound against the endless gray. Elders bowed their heads, whispering prayers in dozens of forgotten dialects, stitching together new rites from ancient shreds. Holt Varen stood among them, boots sinking into the muddy ground, feeling the cold rivulets trail down his face. For a fleeting moment, a lump rose in his throat, a surge of something dangerously close to hope as he realized they were no longer puppets in another's dream. Around him, life stirred. Young engineers etched crude aqueduct plans into wet dust, scavengers traded seeds for cloth, and teachers recited fragments of history by flickering lamplight, determined to weave something whole from the tatters. The world, wounded as it was, had not given up on them. Yet deep beneath the surface, the old battles had not ended. Hidden Emvyr vaults, sealed biocrypts of their forgotten horrors, stirred uneasily. Cold, sour-smelling drafts seeped up from cracked ground, and faint, rhythmic vibrations pulsed through the earth like the shallow heartbeat of something refusing to die. In the vast dead zones where Emvyr terraforming had permanently scarred the earth, strange flora and fauna continued to evolve, untethered from their original designs. Fungal forests taller than skyscrapers writhed with unseen life. Predatory mosses blanketed ancient highways. Survivors reported ghost signals, psionic flares like distant screams echoing across the wastelands. A new fight loomed, one quieter, more insidious than before, a war for the soul of the earth itself. Cora and Holt led expeditions into the deep zones, mapping remnants, cataloging dangers. They salvaged what technology they could, fighting to keep fragile pockets of civilization breathing. They trained scouts to read the sky's shifting colors, to smell the chemical tang of Emvyr taint on the wind. At night, around new fires built with scavenged timber and cracked solar lamps, they recorded their findings, seeding the first rough archives of a reborn world. The insurgents were no longer soldiers. They had become gardeners of a poisoned Eden. On one such expedition deep within the shattered basin of the former Emvyr hive city of Marrow's Reach, Holt stumbled upon a relic of terrible beauty, a crystalline root system still pulsing faintly with Emvyr resonance. His gut twisted, a primal, instinctive revulsion, but he forced himself to step closer, jaw clenched, driven by a defiance too old to name. The structure resembled a vast subterranean heart, tendrils weaving through layers of collapsed infrastructure, feeding on the bones of cities. Unlike the fungal towers that had been toppled, this growth had burrowed downward into the bones of the planet itself, anchoring its alien influence where sunlight could not reach. It was alive. Dormant, but alive. "Burn it," Bryn said immediately, torch in hand, his voice taut with old terror. But Holt hesitated. Destroying it would be simple, but understanding it, dissecting its failure, could arm humanity against whatever other seeds the Emvyr had left behind. Knowledge had been their first casualty in the war, it must not be the last in peace. "Not yet," Holt said. "We need to know what they buried." They sealed the vault for later study, marking its coordinates with warnings in every surviving tongue they knew. Above the site, they erected a crude monument, a shattered Emvyr symbol inverted and bound by iron roots, a message, a memory, a vow. Hope, Holt realized, was not ignorance. It was choosing to see clearly, to confront horror without surrender. In the months that followed, fragile alliances formed among the survivors, scattered communities linking through rebuilt comms, sharing food, knowledge, and stories. The first trade caravans lumbered across dangerous routes, carrying seeds, tools, and songs between camps. Ancient riverways were cleared of debris, and broken transmission towers blinked to life for the first time in decades. New myths began to take shape, not just of survival, but of defiance, resilience, and the stubbornness of roots that refused to die. Tales spread of the Warden of the Roots, a spectral figure said to walk the dead zones, planting iron seeds in poisoned ground where only the fiercest life would dare grow. Songs were written about the singers of the fall, and murals painted on the cracked walls of old metro stations told tales of the insurgents who had shattered the crown. Yet every triumph was tempered by vigilance. In the third month after the fall, a patrol near the former coastlines vanished, their last transmission a garbled scream and a burst of static that smelled, impossibly, like burning copper, reminding all that the Earth's old wounds were far from healed. Patrols ranged wide around the new settlements, watching for signs of Emvyr resurgence, twisted flora blooming too swiftly, strange lights flickering at the edges of sight, dreams infected with foreign hunger. Beneath the poisoned skies, beneath the still-haunted Earth, humanity dug in its heels. The Emvyr had crowned themselves eternal. But it would be human hands, scarred, broken, unbowed, that would inherit the roots beneath. And from that stubborn soil, something wild and beautiful would one day rise, not perfect, not pure, but theirs. The seasons turned. What little remained of Earth's natural cycles stirred uncertainly, like a wounded beast testing its strength. Winters came colder, harsher, ripping across the broken plains with raw winds that howled through the skeletal cities. Summers boiled, bleaching the new fields with unforgiving heat. Storms of ash and broken spores sometimes rose from the dead zones, driving people to shelter for days. Yet through it all, life clawed its way forward, stubborn and relentless. Holt Varen stood atop the jagged ruins of an old highway overpass, scanning the valley below. For a moment, a ghost of memory stirred. He could almost see the highways alive again, rivers of light threading through a living city, before it all fell to dust. Once, this had been the lifeline of a megacity. Now it was a patchwork of fledgling fields, solar farms cobbled together from scavenged tech, and smoke trails rising from clustered settlements. Shimmering cables linked wind towers, feeding electricity to crude desalination rigs. Makeshift greenhouses bulged under patched polymer skins, growing hard-rooted crops resistant to poisoned soil. A human world, raw and aching but living. Cora climbed up beside him, breath misting in the chill. She carried with her a new charter, a handwritten document, passed from camp to camp, bearing the signatures of the first free assemblies. No single authority, no new crowns, only covenants, mutual defense, shared knowledge, stewardship of what remained. The parchment was stitched from scavenged materials, its ink a mixture of soot and oil, its edges burnt to prevent fraying. An artifact as rough and enduring as those who bore it. "They're ready," she said, pressing the parchment into Holt's gloved hands. He unrolled it carefully, fingers tracing each line. The words were imperfect, scratched out and rewritten in the margins, but they burned with conviction. Not the sterile declarations of a fallen world, but the ragged, stubborn breath of a species that refused to vanish. Below them, children ran along the broken riverbanks, chasing crude kites made from stitched banners of fallen Emvyr insignias. They laughed, a sound Holt had once thought lost forever. The river, once diverted into Emvyr harvest pits, now coursed freely again, its muddy waters carrying fragments of dead cities toward new beginnings. Not perfect, Holt said, voice rough. Never was, Cora replied. Never needed to be. Together, they descended the overpass and walked among the people. The mud clung stubbornly to their boots, and the distant thrum of makeshift generators pulsed like a heartbeat through the valley. Faces turned toward them, scarred, weary, radiant with fierce life. Tradesmen mended old machines, fitting shattered technology together with impossible ingenuity. Farmers tested bitter crops in bruised soil, adjusting irrigation lines strung from melted conduits. Teachers read ancient books aloud under torn awnings, their voices steady against the whisper of wind through broken buildings. Everywhere, small acts of reclamation stitched the world back together, thread by stubborn thread. At the heart of the largest settlement, a stone had been erected, a fragment of a fallen crown spire, scorched black but unbroken. People gathered around it each evening, touching its surface with calloused hands, leaving tokens, scraps of cloth, knotted twine, tiny carvings, tributes to survival and remembrance. Upon it were carved the first lines of a new chronicle. We are the ashes of empires, the seeds of a fiercer tomorrow. We remember, we rebuild, we endure. Night fell slowly, the sky littered with unfamiliar constellations, the scars of ancient orbital battles, fragments of shattered satellites, and new stars born of old violence. Holt squinted upward, searching instinctively for constellations from his childhood. But so much had changed, he could find none. It was a different sky now, as battered and reborn as they were. The broken pieces of forgotten wars glittered coldly above, reminders of a past that could not be undone, but might yet be surpassed. In the camps, fires burned in oil drums and pit hearths. The smells of cooking salted meats, rough breads, bitter roots, mingled with the resinous smoke of salvaged timber. Musicians strummed instruments cobbled from wire and scrap, weaving songs both old and new, laments for the lost, anthems for the stubborn living. Holt sat by one such fire that night, surrounded by laughter, argument, and the flickering silhouettes of those who had survived the fall. Cora leaned against a support beam nearby, her face softened by exhaustion and fierce satisfaction. He looked up, past the drifting smoke, to the stars. Not a perfect sky, but a free one. Tomorrow would be carved from scar tissue, from broken stone and battered hands. In his mind, Holt imagined planting the first true orchard beside the new riverbanks. Fruit trees whose roots would gnarl deep into clean soil, a future born not of conquest, but of stubborn care. It would be written in sweat, in sorrow, and in unyielding, stubborn hope. The Emvyr had fallen, but the real work, the slow, painful shaping of a future worth living, had only begun. There would be failures, betrayals, grief. Humanity would stumble as often as it advanced. Yet Holt knew, with a certainty that filled his chest like a second heartbeat, that they would endure. Because survival was not a gift. It was a choice made again and again, bloodied, exhausted, unbowed. And it would be theirs. The story was not over. It had only just begun.